Hello everyone, today we talk about the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Storm Detachment, the paramilitary organization of the NSDAP, the National-Socialist German Workers' Party, emerged from the pressing requirement for an orderly service to safeguard the early mass meetings of the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the AP, the German Workers' Party in Munich, a necessity that became apparent as soon as the party organized its initial large-scale gatherings in January of 1920. On November the 12th, 1920, the watchmaker Emil Maurice, whose Jewish ancestry was then unknown to Adolf Hitler, assembled a group drawn predominantly from various Freikorps contingents. I made a video about the latter, as you know. We'll come back on them as well with a mini-series. And a smaller number of Bavarian Reichswehr, that is, nominal imperial defense soldiers, formally establishing the Turn- und Sportabteilung, the gymnastics and sport division, as a nominal cover for this whole protection detachment, which was initially abbreviated as SS to denote Saalschutz, Saalschutz, the SS, halt protection. In reality, the systematic construction of what would evolve into the SA had commenced as early as 1919, progressing in parallel with the political consolidation of the AP, which was rechristened as the NSDAP in February 1920 to broaden its appeal, including the addition of quote-unquote socialists to the name, and despite, in fact, Hitler's objections. By the way, for those who, want to understand both the sort of early, not just National Socialist movement, but in this sense from which ferment this came from. As you know, the SA was much more red in practice, and Hitler would eventually maintain, of course, in the name, the socialist element. But, say, regardless of certain Hitlerian views, of course, like also from the early 20th century state and the level of sort of, to some extent, socialist characteristics that this had acquired, especially in a moment of, but this also in Wilhelm Germany, right? What the same Bismarck did in order to essentially win, to defeat the socialists. He supported Catholic welfare system. So this is something we will, if anything, leave for another topic. But there is both, say, Hitler's initial objection, but at the same time, as we know, in National Socialism, the full integration of the term socialist within that. And this was notoriously, if you know just like literally a minimum about nationalist socialist history, aimed at, in that political and historical context, at, of course, attracting in the same way left-leaning workers, right? I'm throwing, I tell you what, I had prepared the script for another video, but I had this one ready, so I thought I wasted time for half an hour, and I didn't know what to do. And I launched myself with the Sturmabteilung, because normally on Sunday I want something that sort of rocks hard. This was not really scheduled for today, but I decided to get a bit more into it without sort of too much chit-chat, but you know that from Schwerpunkt you're going to get not much a chit-chat, but massive introductions about this kind of topics. But this is exactly what you find in this actual history. This is an enormous debate. I don't need really to make it, primarily because of what socialism means in America today, even just as a sort of punchline, as a almost a rhetorical figure, right? And not because socialism does not exist or is not terrible in many ways, but because we tend to, in fact, the left tends from the other side to simply claim that since, Nazism wasn't objectively it depends on how you want to define it. Many right-wing ideologists today say, well, basically Hitler was a socialist. Today, we have people like Nick Fuentes that sort of flipped the entire paradigm, so you don't know what people think anymore. But this is typical, of course, like the social-culturally inferior background from which these people stem from. But one cannot deny, especially through the history of the SA, and that's partly why I made this video as well, that was a very specifically leftistic wing of the National-Socialist movement that is directly tied to the same socialist term as well, and the actual necessity of Hitler and his associates, let's put it in this way, at this time, when everything was still very much in theory, and the fight had to be, the camp, so to say, had to be sort of carried out up to what happened in 1933, is actually a very important thing that was not even just a national, it wasn't just a Hitler thing, but it was specifically part of the German political landscape of the time. And again, I'm going to make more videos on this topic because it's of extreme importance. And whoever is trying to sell you the notion that socialist is just a strange name, it was out there for no reason, he's wrong. As much as you can be wrong if you claim that National Socialism was straightforward socialism, it definitely had some certain socialistic features, but obviously was explicitly against the entire sort of matrix and mold that socialism historically represented. In any case, that's a discourse for another video. Now, following Hitler's acquisition of dictatorial authority within the party in July 1921, this orderly service transformed into a specialized party troop dedicated to preserving his dominance. From the foundational Saalschutz that we illustrated through a series of developmental stages arose a dedicated thug unit specialized in orchestrating provoked confrontations with left-wing parties, in fact, particularly the KPD, so the Communist Party of Germany, resulting in frequent and brutal street fights that escalated tensions across urban centers. You can find more of this in the previous years as far as the Freikorps had been concerned. We talk about sort of the Bolshevik revolution in Germany at the end of the war, and we'll also talk, of course, about more the aforementioned reference to the fact that still Hitler aimed at gaining the brute force, in fact, of the useful Fourth Estaters, including the ones that had leftistic sympathies. The designation Sturmabteilung was officially conferred on November the 4th to this group of 1921 in the aftermath of an exceptionally violent whole battle within the Munich of Brauhaus. If you haven't been there, you're missing a great part of European spirit. A fantastic place that naturally was sort of different and not different in many ways from those times, but where nationalists, in this case, had clashed with the KPD members, and a compact SA contingent decisively overpowered the adversaries. This confrontation, immortalized as the Saalschlacht, meeting whole battle, right, ascended to mythic proportions in SA mythology over time. The adopted name drew direct inspiration from the infiltration tactics pioneered by Willy Rohr during the First World War to shatter the stalemate of trench warfare, with the inaugural official German Stormtrooper unit sanctioned on March 2, 1915, on the Western Front under the 8th Corps to trial experimental armaments and refine breakthrough strategies in small squads of a few soldiers each. We're looking largely at veterans, right, and that are into the cultistic notion that, again, self-sacrifice, the sort of the adherence to a transcendental, essentially, unity directed, but this is the same ideology of the Führer, of the sort of what this had historically meant, also in German imperial history and before, like, was to be sublimated and exalted in this kind of war. Naturally, this was another scenario where war, sort of this kind of fight was at least attemptedly enacted. Of course, it's very different from war proper, and in general, we should also analyze the military sense of this all, because the early Freikorps in 1918-19 were actually, like, they were essentially part of the same, they were paramilitary in nature, but they came straight from people who had just left the front and were now to repress violently the Bolshevik Revolution. and they did their job, right, in that sense. The later Freikorps of the Nazi era are something different, right? They have really little, they are inspired to that, but to those, but they are a completely different phenomenon, right? And the big one were actually the early ones. In any case, we're also seeing, aside from the group and sort of the broader population and what this had meant at the end of the war for having lots of veterans employing these roles, like still indeed a matter of veterans themselves, like all, most sort of figures at the head here were expressing properly, again, that cultistic, identitaristic fashion as veterans, as people who could basically restore German power, identity, and sort of glory, honor after World War One, in their view. On October the 2nd, 1916, the Generalquartiermeister, so the Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, mandated all Western armies to establish Stormtrooper battalions, first deployed in support of the 8th Army's siege of Riga and the Battle of Caporetto, achieving wider application during the 1918 Spring Offensive, that also have a series on that displaced Allied lines by tens of kilometers. Initially, we covered exactly that part. Then eventually things failed. The Kaiserschlacht was the last German offensive and basically the last lifeline that the Germans had to at least obtain some sort of better negotiated peace. Now, at the moment of its official naming, the SA, structured into approximately 21 groups and comprising roughly 30 men, maintained presences not solely in Munich, but extended to Freising, Landshut, and Bad Tölz. Command transitioned swiftly in these formative years. From Maurice, 1920-21, that again was a Jew, interestingly. And this is something should be also, there are many sort of oddities in National Socialism, but also in general fascism at the time. For example, I don't know, the early fascist movement in Italy contained lots of Jews, as a matter of fact. Then, of course, their affiliation, many of them were, atheists in a broader sense. So ideologically speaking, we're looking at the different things, but knowing especially what was enforced with racial laws in Nazi Germany. And also later in Italy after Hitler, this is very, very fascinating. And there are many examples, of course, of Jews that were Jews because they were normal German citizens that, of course, sympathized with these ultra-nationalistic movements, including the famous Kantorowicz, which, as you know, is also a great medievalist and one that had a very interesting story, a dramatic story as a World War I veteran, as a prominent German historian, a great exalter of German grandeur and so on, and that eventually abandoned Europe during Nazi persecution after he had been, by the way, taken away from universities, and which destroyed him because he really was fully on board with sort of the general trend. He said, but I wrote such great masterpieces like Frederick II, all for Germany, and this is what I do. And when it went to United States, he had exposed sort of an identity crisis, or at least some remorse regarding what he had done and what he had been, and even such historical masterpieces as he wrote, he almost renegated in practice. In any case, brief parenthesis, after Maurice you have Hans Ulrich Klinsch, 1921-1923, a former naval officer affiliated with the Marinebrigade Herhard that had participated in the unsuccessful Kapp Putsch, and a member of the clandestine Organisation Consul responsible for political assassinations, by the way. And I shall make more videos probably about nationalist socialist violence at this point, in a more comprehensive fashion, because I actually ideated this video as a bit of a sort of military history of the SA. Not probably even a political history of the same, but how did they come about, how were they organized, etc. So we will talk at some point about much more German political history. As you know, I'm preparing lots of contemporary history content compared to the previous years, and this is just partly an introduction. But famously enough, Ernst Röhm, this is the key figure, an SDP affiliate and serving Reichswehr captain with extensive connections to right-wing defense associations, assumed responsibility for constructing the party's proprietary orderly service, forging the initial Saalschutz from ex-members of Minenwerfer-Kompanie 19. So these were the actual, guys dealing with explosives of the former Bavarian army, by the way, because of course Germany was federally, created and maintained, as a matter of fact, across the two pre and post-war period, appointing commanders drawn from the disbanded Marinebrigade Herart in April 1920. On August 3rd, 1921, Rome designated Hermann Herart as the inaugural leader. We promptly delegated the role to Clinch on August 8th. Clinch faced arrest in early September 1921 in connection with the assassination of Matthias Erzberger and was provisionally succeeded by Maurice until his acquittal and release in 1922. You understand how important these figures are. I mean, Matthias Erzberger, as you know, he was essentially leader of a left-wing leader of the Catholic Party, and he was assassinated in as much as the signer, the deferment of the Compiègne armistice, and it was one of the victims of the SA. So this is also important, as we'll see the story now how it unfolds. But the SA was never separated from the Nazi movement, right? It was autonomous from Hitler until the Night of the Long Knives, and it also existed until 1945, as we will see. After that, however, is mostly a ceremonial, symbolic thing of the National-Socialist revolution, as the SS had basically taken over everything, as you know, right? But Hitler properly took control of that after Rome was, this is, big spoiler, in case you have missed, primary school in a first world country, taken out. Now, functioning as a Wehrverband, so literally a defense association, the SA served to intimidate political adversaries and was integrated into the Bavarian governmental mobilization schemes, undergoing military instruction from the 7th Bavarian Reichswehrdivision, notably through Pioneer Battalion 7 and Infantry Regiment 19, which provided training in tactics and weaponry. So they were essentially associated still to the military, and they had, of course, a heavy, as you know, veteran background and mentality about this, a cult also of the body, of athleticism. They responded very much like to the broader and very intensely idealistic National-Socialist ideology. By 1923, the Munich SA had expanded to approximately 1150 men, equipped with artillery, hundreds, and cavalry platoons, where commanders adopted former military appellations such as Gewehr or Geschützführer, for example, rifle or gun leader, to underscore their quasi-military character. So something that was not was badly stomached as merely paramilitary from their side. The year 1923 was marked by intense, often violent, to say the least, clashes between right and left-wing factions, encompassing the events of the so-called German October. At Rome's instigation, the Arbeitsgemeinschaft, the Vaterländischen Verbände, the working community of patriotic associations, was established, where in February of the same year, amalgamating the SA with entities including the Vereinigten Vaterländischen Verbände Münchens, so the United Patriotic Associations of Munich, the Reichsflagge, so the imperial flag, Bund Oberland, Oberland League, and the Gau Niederbayern, District Lower Bavaria, of Bund Bayern und Reich, namely Bavaria and Empire League. On May 1st, 1923, this alliance sought to obstruct SPD, so the famous and still existing Social Democratic Party of Germany, and trade union May processions in Munich, mobilizing several thousand armed participants, among them 1,300 SA members, at the Oberwiesenfeld. However, they yielded without resistance to the opposing deployment of police and Reichswehr forces, surrendering arms illicitly obtained from army depots in defiance of prohibitions. Röhm, deemed accountable by Bavarian Reichswehr commander Otto von Lossow, was relieved of his position and reassigned to Grafenwöhr following a period of leave. On November 9, 1923, roughly 2,000 SA members, led militarily by Hermann Göring, joined the Hitler-Ludendorff putsch. During the attempted coup, 16 NSADP affiliates, including 5 from Hitler's personal Stoßtrupp Adolf Hitler, in fact, the shock troop Adolf Hitler, group established in 1923 from the most aggressive elements of a new Schutztruppe, protection troop named Sturmstaffel, Storm Squadron, again abbreviated SS, composed of lingering Freikorps personnel, were killed by Bavarian state police and military, thereby furnishing the party with its inaugural blood witnesses or martyrs. Göring escaped to Innsbruck to evade capture. So we're talking Austria, right? In the wake of the putsch failure, Reichspräsident Friedrich Ebert conferred executive authority upon Reichswehr head Hans von Seeckt, who proscribed the NSDAP and the KPD on November the 23rd, 1923. So the most extremistic fringes of the political arc. The SA endured 3 bans: November the 23rd, 1923, April 13th, 1932, and October the 10th, 1945 in their entire history, as well as 2 legalizations, February the 16th, 1925 and June the 14th, 1932. To evade prohibition, the SA functioned at this point as Frontbahn, that is another sort of name, from April 1924 to February 1925. Upon his release from detention on April the 1st, 1924, Röhm, entrusted by Hitler with the military oversight of the outlaw Kampfbund, the Combat League, and SA prevailed as SA leader. Over Göring, during a conference held in Salzburg on May 17 to the 18th, 1924, formulating directives for reorganization. By 1924, SA formations had proliferated beyond Bavaria under pseudonyms or within allied associations in the Ruhr region, Westphalia, and parts of northeast and central Germany, albeit with significant membership volatility across the spectrum of defense associations. Röhm additionally conceptualized a Reich-wide party-autonomous Frontbahn incorporating the prohibited SA as its nucleus while remaining accessible to other Wehrverbände. Although Hitler opposed the scheme, apprehending risks to his impending release and potential loss of SA control, Röhm successfully launched it in August 1924, rapidly amassing approximately 30,000 adherents. On February 27, 1925, merely one day following the revocation of the ban, Röhm reconstituted the SA in its pristine fashion, in accordance with, in fact, the 1923 regulations. Yet his unilateral reorganization, which aspired to elevate it beyond Hitler's preference for a simple Salzschutz into a full-fledged combat entity, precipitated his relinquishment of leadership on April the 17th, 1925. To immediately understand the competition and the tension within the National-Socialist movement because of Röhm's plan. For the subsequent 18 months, command was decentralized as a consequence to regional party officials until November the 1st, 1926, when the erstwhile Freikorps commander Franz Pfeffer von Salomon was installed as Oberster SA Führer, that is, Supreme SA leader, placing all extant National-Socialist combat formations, including, in fact, the SA, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Protection Squadron, the Hitlerjugend, these are all the acronyms, Hitler Youth, and the Studentenbund, namely the National-Socialist German Students' League, under his authority. Hitler now envisioned the SA chiefly for ceremonial marches and orchestrated violent assaults on KPD and SPD affiliates, socialists to communists, clashing in street and hall engagements with the communist Roter Frontkämpferbund, the Red Front Fighters League, and the SPD-aligned Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, the imperial banner black-red-gold, while also assaulting Jews in Christian youth organizations such as the Kolping-Jugend. This aspect is also very interesting because, of course, the incredibly ambiguous relations. We were talking about this the other day, and I remember regarding probably between National Socialism and a Christian country like Germany, aside also from the anti-Jewish persecution, but the difficulties in understanding at times Nazi ideology stem exactly from probably a willful misunderstanding of this allegedly sort of ambiguous. There was an ambiguity between that, but not in the higher spheres of National Socialism, or at least probably Hitler's circle of the most loyal regarding what Christianity had to be. It was heavily despised, and there isn't actually much of an evidence that it was, but in fact, just a tactical move that it was tolerated, obviously in a Christian country. But the ideological complicity and implications may stem from a broader sort of conservative alignment, keeping sort of Nazism. Also, I'm talking internationally. Think about this story, the idea that the papacy enabled at least certain Nazi atrocities National Socialism to be in charge. This is something that, as you know, is extremely contentious in historiography. There is an endless debate about that. I'm not going to discuss it, but it's interesting to obviously see that there were specific Christian movements that the Nazis battle against, just like against the socialists, the communists, the Jewish ones. Besides, there will actually be Christian National Socialist sections later on. There were actually a minority group per se. It was implicit, of course, that if you were, an average German, therefore obviously a Nazi at the time, because the myth that, if you are in places like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, and even if you sort of don't like what's going on and you still don't do anything, it makes you automatically and specifically still a Nazi or fascist. And we should understand that too, in not even just in accusatory term, but to say, okay, so let them die all. It's literally understanding that major Western countries at this point were actually into this, right? At every level, regardless of sort of individual sort of perceptions of this, still the straightforward political responsibility falls on the entire people as a whole. And any excuse also on the other side is a pile of BS. And it's actually very cowardly, as much as most of these people were actually, by the way, at large, supportive of their regimes. Otherwise, this could have not existed. But the point I was making is that, of course, at that point, as an average German, you're both a Nazi and a Christian at the same time. The two things could be, and it's important to stress, ideologically separated, because National Socialism was not fundamentally about that level of sort of Christian identity, but at the same time, the two things overlapped. All right, but we will talk about this another point. And it's important to distinguish exactly every single word, because if you take this out of context, it may sound 1,000 different things that may have absolutely nothing to do with one another. Now, going back to the SA, by early December 1926, a standardized hierarchical framework crystallized. The foundational group comprising about a dozen men, multiple Gruppen forming a troop, in fact, up to 5 troops constituting a storm ideally, up to 5 Stürmer aggregating into a Standarte, and several Standarten overseen by a Gausturm, a district storm. right? So this was the local sort of administrative hierarchy of the SA. The Brigade was intercalated between Standarte and Gausturm by mid-1927. By autumn 1927, 17 Gaustürmer operated across the Reich. Starting in 1928, these reported to 7 Oberführer, senior leaders responsible for the regions Ost, East, North, West and Mitte, the center, Süd, Ruhr, and Österreich, obviously Austria as well. The SA Oberführer Süd, based in Munich, was the former Major August Schneidhuber. Overall, SA manpower in 1926 was approximately at 10 to 15,000. In Bavaria, Gaustürme encompassed Oberbayern, Schwaben, Upper Bavaria, Swabia, and Franken, Franconia, with Pfalz, Palatinate, and Saargebiet, the Saar region, forming a combined unit together. The Munich Party headquarters in 1926-1927 pursued worker enlistment through the vehement anti-capitalist posturing. Other incredibly important thing, concurrently mounting aggressive operations against left parties. Also very important to understand here, engendering essentially persistent frictions with the party elite at the same time. There was, again, a very strong, properly Marxistic influence, or at least Marxian influence proper in particular in the SA. And this, again, was the most sort of red branch of the National-Socialists, the most socialist in nature. Because, of course, and we will see it, this is notorious ideologically, the ideally plutocratic sense that, again, there was a West that was the most modernized, secularized, wealthy, sort of financially hegemonic, so namely Britain, the United States, France, and so on. This was understood through probably the German Sonderweg mentality as something different from, not just from Germany. It was thus not understood as a Western country, or at least in that sort of plutocratically corrupted sense in their view. And also, obviously, distinguishing them from the socialists, from the Soviet Union, and so the idea of the third way, right, and that obviously mixes part of the wall, as a matter of fact, and that's also in part the relative ambiguity, especially at this time, especially as long as the SA was around. In May 1927, the Munich SA mounted a rebellion against what it perceived as an overly temperate and administrative party apparatus, because these people really wanted just to beat the blip out of ours. Like, that they really lived for that, was their greatest exaltation, so they felt as if they were being normalized by Hitler and the whole sort of influence that was exercised on their identity. A key instigator of this rebellion was the merchant and ex-lieutenant Edmund Heines, who had merged Bavarian Freikorps Rossbach survivors into the SA on September the 2nd, 1926. This is also very interesting because you see, of course, plenty of Germans at this point. German males, also pretty young ones still, are veterans of World War I, and there are privatistic clienterly dependencies, especially in a time in history that now would also precipitate with the Great Depression, and that, of course, hadn't been quite, a fun time up to that point, quite as well. And you have this associationism, which is based on such thuggery, on this capacity to exercise violence, also on the basis of previous military experience. Heines was ousted but reinstated in 1929. In Mittelfranken, Franconia, the SA disintegrated in 1928 amid disputes with Gauleiter district leader Julius Streicher, subsequently restructured under the new Gau's Sturmführer, district storm leader Philipp Wurzbacher. In 1929, the Oberführer domains were redesignated as properly OSAF Stellvertretergebiete, the OSAF deputy areas. The Süd territory embraced Bayern with its dual Gauss-Stürmer, Bayern and Franken, alongside Baden and Württemberg, Pfalz/Saarfeld under West. The incumbent Oberführer Süd, August Schneidhuber, became OSAF Stellvertreter Süd. The Groß-München Brigade, the Greater Munich Brigade, was bifurcated into Standarten 1 and 2 in March 1929, augmented by a third Standarter Münchenland, the Standard Munich countryside, in August. Commencing March 1929, SA personnel over 40 years were consolidated into reserve storms to enhance the combat efficacy of active units. So in practice, they sort of put a bit sort of the older ones aside. This was, again, 11 years after the end of the war. Preceding the 1930 Reichstag election, a profound schism arose as SA demanded assured parliamentary list positions for prominent figures, a proposition Hitler repudiated to maintain separation, in fact, between SA command and electoral mandates. In other words, he wanted to have the full political control of the entire National-Socialist movement and controlling himself every aspect of who would have eventually been represented politically in the parliament. Pfeffer von Salomon's endorsement triggered a Berlin SA strike on August 30th, 1930, convening a general muster in lieu of securing a Joseph Goebbels campaign event at the Sportpalast, followed by occupation of the Enstabgau headquarters and the Angriff editorial offices, culminating in scaffolds resolved only by police intervention summoned by the SS. Hitler hastened from Munich, reinstating stability by personally claiming the OSAF title, properly the Oberste SA Führer, so properly the Supreme SA leadership, upon Pfeffer's recent resignation and instituting the Stabschef, Chief of Staff position for operational management assigned to Ernst Röhm. Walter's stance advocating forcible power seizure in contrast to Hitler's post-1925 legality strategy, solemnly affirmed under oath, by the way, during the 1930 Ulm Reichswehr trial, was removed after the Brüning administration's March 1931 emergency ordinance suspending certain Weimar constitutional rights. We are here after, again, in the wake of the Great Depression. There is properly, again, a game that Hitler is playing by acting sort of on the edge regarding legality, and in fact this more violent branch of National Socialism is quite, again, difficult to handle because they truly believe they can take over at some point as a veritable army power in Germany. Stennis retaliated with his eponymous putsch on April the 1st, 1931, forcibly seizing Berlin-Gau premises and Angriff, publishing a special edition proclaiming revolutionary and socialist ideals, yet unable to attract substantial SA defections. In part also because of that, because the SA had, there were different reasons, but of course the SA was not merely sort of a socialistic movement as a whole. It was sort of very, in this sense, unprejudiced and mostly interested in violent power taking. But there was also definitely, again, a red matrix in this whole. One could, again, philosophically and politologically debate on whether the same National Socialism within the context of early 20th century sort of classical political ideology was inspired to a de facto, in fact, nationalistic and or socialistic movement in general, as we understand these specific movements being in fact quite leftistic by, say, mid-19th century standards and being very post-traditional. And again, I'm not going to do this because this video is not specifically about ideology, but it's mostly about seeing a bit the rise and fall of the SA in a strictly sort of manpower sense. Now, Berlin police terminated the takeover. You understand also how, say, at the time the same SS intervened. They had different relations with the police, trying also to stem this SA shenanigans. This resulted in the expulsion of stands and roughly 500 adherents. Propelled by the global economic depression and NSDAP electoral triumphs, the SR ranks swelled dramatically, right? And that's where the attritions start also to surface in more direct fashion with Hitler. 60,000 SA members by November 1930. This is becoming really big. Röhm inherited nearly 77,000 upon his January 1931 appointment, surging to 118,982, we know at least to the last man, allegedly, by April, surpassing 200,000 by November. This is immense. This is huge. This is really, really big. And it's Röhm in control of that, right? Of course, Hitler has a grip on it, but still, right, these men are mostly interpreting the SA sort of version of the Röhm's version of the story rather than Hitler's at large. We're talking a dramatic 260,438 by December 1931, peaking at 450,000 in summer of 1932. And totaling 427,000 by the close of 1932-1933. This surge changed everything, and naturally Hitler also had to take very specific measures. This expansion derived from intense turnover of street combatants oscillating with the KPD and Rotfront-Kämpferbund, compounded by a massive influx following the NSDAP's May 1st, 1933 membership moratorium. Both the NSDAP and SA vested considerable expectations in the 1932 Reichspräsident contest, pitting Hitler against incumbent Paul von Hindenburg prior to the decisive April the 10th runoff. SA units were placed on high alert, implying impending escalation. Coupled with incriminating documents uncovered in Prussian police raids, this catalyzed the post-Hindenburg re-election prohibition on April 13, 1932, enacted through a Brüning emergency decree that shuttered SA facilities, a step long advocated by interior ministers of democratic Länder, the German states, particularly Prussia's, against the backdrop of the Geneva Disarmament Conference, where Germany insisted on Victor Power's disarmament and its own military parity, rendering tolerance of a paramilitary force vastly outnumbering the Reichswehr's authorized 100,000 men itself politically untenable. The interdiction dealt a crippling setback to the NSDAP amid acute fiscal strains. Goebbels confided to his diary on April 23rd the imperative of seizing power imminently to avert electoral exhaustion. Conservative circles erupted in indignation, inundating Hindenburg and ministers Wilhelm Groener and Kurt von Schleicher with appeals notably from former Crown Prince Wilhelm extolling SA personnel as exemplary human material undergoing valuable discipline, and from his brother August Wilhelm, himself an SA commander, by the way. So that's how you understand from this only how permeated German society was with the Nazi movement. And regardless of, again, the difference between the NSDAP and the SA, but how sort of down to the very core of the nation identity this thing really was. This was essentially a massive attempt to remilitarize Germany, as the Nazis will actually succeed in. as sort of an undigested, of course, peace settlement, and or at least all what came to amplify this motivation later on, because it's not simply what happened at Versailles that brought, in hindsight, Nazis to power. That's sort of very superficial and distorted way of seeing Hitler's rise. Schleicher, in covert negotiations with Hitler himself, of course, pledged ban revocation in exchange for vague assurances of Reichstag toleration of a successor cabinet to Brüning. Schleicher then maneuvered against both Brüning and his superior Groener, whose botched May parliamentary address led to his May the 12th resignation, with the entire cabinet dissolving on May the 30th. Hindenburg, because you understand, naturally, Hitler needed the SI, so this could not be simply dissolved, right? So it was a problem within the National-Socialist movement for Hitler in particular. But at the same time, Hitler needed those numbers and that force in order to maintain power and rise into the top. And Hindenburg designated, notoriously, if you know the story of these years, like Franz von Papen as a chancellor, who per the NSDAP accord dissolved the Reichstag on June the 4th and rescinded the SA ban on June the 14th, timely for unleashing SA in the campaign. Leading to the July 31st, 1932 Reichstag poll, near civil war conditions prevailed, claiming about 300 lives and over 1,100 injuries, with SA bearing principal responsibility for this. So that was the immediate effect of, maintaining, of course, this body intact. The summer struggle for seats unleashed unbridled criminal impulses against adversaries that naturally had their own force, and so it wasn't just merely, again, the terrible Nazis against some angels on the other side, culminating in 24 deaths and 284 severe injuries in Prussia during the campaign's final 10 days alone. This tells you also by now how deteriorated the German political, sort of German democratic situation really was before Hitler's ascension. Hitler's ascension to the Reichskanzler, to rank Reich Chancellor on January the 30th, 1933, which was jubilantly marked by the now over 400,000 strong SA through a nocturnal torchlight procession originating at the Großer Stern, proceeding via the Brandenburg Gate to the Wilhelmstrasse Reichskanzlei. Numerous SA members anticipated an instantaneous coup-like violent seizure of total control. The Boxheimer documents surfaced in autumn 1939 outline SA blueprint for a state overthrow. Nevertheless, National Socialist leadership eschewed an SA-led push, which at that juncture would have entailed essentially a straightforward civil war against the Rotfront Kämpferbund and Reichsbanner with indeterminate resolution, compounded by uncertainties regarding the Reichswehr's allegiance and that of the Prussian police, historically under robust social democratic sway. This is also important to remember, because even though the establishment at large was sort of, even as we've seen, dealing with National Socialism and even taking part in broader movement, even in the SA, etc., there was a still sort of idea that these extremists were something of an exception, of something alien to the system that had been established after the war. The National Socialist strategic objective was Gleichschaltung, coordination, through coordinated, essentially assimilation rather than outright insurrection. Nevertheless, the SA persisted in operations. Immediately post January the 30th in Berlin, multiple fatalities occurred alongside widespread injuries. Autonomous SA detachments executed impromptu house searches and detentions on their own account. On February the 22nd, 1933, Provisional Prussian Interior Minister Hermann Göring instituted the Hilfspolizei, so basically an auxiliary police, recruited chiefly from the SA ranks, thereby embedding them within the state coercive mechanism, granting extensive jurisdictional powers that simultaneously satiated their operational zeal while directing it. This was a very important step up for the SA that thus felt now to be fully part of the system. All right, and under such as a key figure like Goering at the same time. And this SA presence further compelled conventional police to conform to the novel regime, with estimates indicating 3,000 to 5,000 Berlin SA elevated to auxiliary status. Concurrently, the SA Feldpolizei, the SA Field Police, materialized, forming the nucleus of the subsequent SA Feldjäger Corps, the SA Field Hunter Corps, based at the Berlin Paperstrasse SA detention facility, originally tasked with apprehending and confining regime opponents, but increasingly handling inter-organizational discipline until 1935. The Prussian Hilfspolizei was disbanded in early August 1933. It was not to go on, and the Reichstag Brandverordnung, the Reichstag Fire Decree, promulgated in the night following the February 27 to 28, 1933, arson, effectively nullified Weimar constitutional safeguards days before the March 1933 Reichstag election, sanctioning the extensive persecution of the NSDAP foes by police and SA, which had already commenced on a grand scale post-seizure, by the way. The Marine SA, the Naval SA, inflicted torture upon political detainees aboard a Bremerhaven ghost ship from May to October 1933. Between March and autumn 1933, the SA indiscriminately avenged itself upon political and ideological adversaries within proprietary facilities, including improvised wild concentration camps with approximations of around 50,000 detainees. To Hitler, the SA's orchestrated terror proved indispensable in the consolidation phase. In fact, it enabled the intimidation and subjugation of opponents while portraying him to conservatives as the singular figure capable of restraining the SA, that, as we've seen, were partially autonomous. And so there was Hitler acted as a tip of the balance in front of he was successfully manipulative, alternately hinting at unleashing the SA fully or vowing temperance, thereby securing conservative endorsement of the terror, essentially, in exchange for its purported containment within tolerable bounds, especially against, in fact, leftistic forces. Once the terror subsided, by the way, SA figures who had assumed local commissar roles required compensation, exemplified by the athletically novice Hans von Schammer und Ostens elevation to Reichspostkommissar, so the Reichssports Commissioner, shortly after the takeover, subsequently Reichssportführer, the Reichssports leader, with state secretary rank. By the conclusion of 1933, as Hitler fortified his authority leveraging the SA, he withdrew favor in summer 1934. Röhm, appointed Stabschef in 1930, advocated a divergent SA paradigm, seeking to detach it anew from party oversight, post-seizure demanding a quote-unquote second revolution and establishment of a National-Socialist Volksheer, so properly a National Socialist People's Army, to supplant the Reichswehr, with its units integrating into the SA to constitute this People's Army. And in this sense, things were just going too far, because, of course, this would have given the SA like an unprecedented level of societal control that at that point would have been directly dangerous for the same Hitler. And so for him, the SA had exhausted its utility in terror for a century. They had been, again, the toughest and sort of more assimilatingly useful branch of the broader movement. But now their autonomy had to be truncated. By mid-1934, the SA unwieldy multitude obstructed further power centralization itself. Therefore, it was really becoming more of a, not necessarily an anarchic movement, but one that could, at that point, have many heads, like a hydra to some extent, requiring Reichswehr backing for prospective war ambitions. Hitler disseminated distorted Röhm quotations to fabricate impressions of an imminent revolt, to attribute naturally on him. Confronting, in fact, 3.5 million SA members would have posed formidable challenges to maintenance of order by police or the Reichswehr. Röhm repeatedly emphasized in internal party forums such things like, consider nearly 4 million ruffians stand behind me, evidently in jest, yet resonating menacingly to Hitler and Reichswehr commanders. These revolution whispers were chiefly amplified by former SA head and nominal SA Obergruppenführer Göring and Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the latter repeatedly pledging unconditional SS fidelity to Röhm. What this meant, by the way, was not that Himmler was actually siding with Röhm, but that there was essentially a double play where this interaction would be brought properly as a proof of infidelity, of Röhm's infidelity to Hitler. Right? Göring was only nominally at this point the SA senior group leader, and as we've seen, there was sort of a blurred hierarchy within this ambiguity in the relation between the SA and the NS. Another faction intent on enfeebling both groups as a regime comprised Vice Chancellor Papen's Young Conservative, the Young Conservatives aides, directed by press chief Herbert von Bose and Bavarian jurist publicist Edgar J. Jung, who conspired to topple the National-Socialist order in favor of a moderated right-wing administration, decrying as a radical verbiage as the ultimate ascendancy of inferiors fostering terror, brutality, and anarchy. So the foretestators, if you want, with this sort of bitter, even leftistic aftertaste. So probably also in a classist direction. Remember, these guys were against capitalism. They, in this sense, again, you can be, as far as that is concerned, also fully right-wing and being against capitalism. But in particular, there was a veritably classist tension between these essentially lesser people and the proper German establishment, as it had been up to this point, also in a conservative direction, or at least when you look at different parts of Germany, but also still with the idea that the army is to maintain the order, that there is still, in that sense, sort of Prussian legacy to the wall, allowing for the democratic process to happen, paradoxically, but still, at this point, given the surge of extremism. To date, no substantiation exists of any genuine Röhm putsch orchestration or imminence by the time we know, we spoiled at the beginning. Röhm's homosexual orientation, which was true, by the way, a publicly acknowledged party secret, in particular prior to 1933, via outlets like Fritz Gerlich's Der gerade Weg, the straight path, was weaponized as pretext. Of course, again, in this cultism, there was a lot of sort of perversion at many levels. So they're suspending judgment in general for the video. Otherwise, they sanction me as it happened. But you know what? Here we're looking at also you can enter the head of these people and realize what what their conduct, generally speaking, was about. Now, on June the 30th, 1934, Hitler accosted Röhm at his Bad Wiessee retreat, leveling charges of coup plotting, and homosexuality as well. SS contingents apprehended the SA High Command in pre-dawn hours. The majority were executed forthwith by a dedicated Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the bodyguard regiment, platoon commanded by Josef Dietrich. Röhm himself was dispatched on July the 1st in Stadelheim prison by Dachau commandant Theodor Eicke and assistant Michael Lippert. The Röhm putsch ensnared additional inconvenient figures. SA Obergruppenführer Edmund Heines, ex-Reichskanzler Kurt von Schleicher and his spouse, former NSDAP organizer Gregor Strasser, prior Bavarian Generalstaatskommissar Gustav von Kahr, and Papen confidants Bose and Jung. The purge conferred multiple advantages upon Hitler, to say the least. The eradication of paramilitary competition secured the general's confidence. And as such, he probably beheaded the SA, right? He neutralized its menace to his leadership because he eliminated the SA leadership itself. This was, again, so momentous for Hitler because it brought to his elevation in esteem among grand and heavy industry by marginalizing the predominantly unemployed and petit bourgeois SA that weren't, in fact, mostly just like Fort estaters per se, but at least probably in the positions of command were this sort of, again, petit bourgeois, sort of veteran, sort of more patriotically fervent, but in this sense also ideologically fringe, especially as socio-economical intuitions were concerned. There was really an extra sort of element of just purely violent lifestyle, right? From unemployment, you can understand this was largely also stemming from the general crisis of 1929 and its outcome. So there was a lot, however, in terms of societal danger posed by the SA that without leadership at least could be paralyzed and would start seeing now with the continuation of the National-Socialist movement and Hitler's primacy at this point as Chancellor of the Reich, the most obvious guide that had always been, because again these are two distinct sections, but Hitler is the head of both in a broader sort of moral hegemonic sense. Pacification of a latent intra-party threat was also obvious in here, resolving this ambiguity, because it's difficult, even as we've seen, to say not was whom exactly, but where does the prerogatives of the NSDAP started and the S1 ended, and vice versa. There was the compelled disarmament with weaponry transferred to Reichswehr, accelerating rearmament as well. So all the weapons of the SA were basically cashed now by the militarizing Germany under Hitler's government. There was also the facilitation of Himmler's detachment of the SS, so originally Hitler's 1925 bodyguard from the SA oversight, which had been a thing, matter of competition. The SS were not that powerful and big at this point, as the SA as a broader popular nationwide movement really were. And the detachment of the SS from the SA oversight was formalized mere days before the removal, from enabling Himmler to occupy the ensuing power void and endow the SS. Its subdivisions like the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Security Service, and the Waffen-SS, the Armed SS, with unparalleled National-Socialist dominance. Casualties range from 150 to 200, this encompassing 50 command personnel, which tells you how sort of probably beheading this movement was. In the purge aftermath directed by Stabschef Viktor Lutze, the SA receded into political irrelevance for the rest of National-Socialist history, redirecting efforts towards imparting pre-military instruction to members, formally minimize essentially a sport with defense relevance rather than some potentially armed insurrection nationwide. Enrollment contracted precipitously at this point. In fact, from nominal 4.5 million in June 1934 to 2.6 million by September. 1.6 million in October 1935, 1.2 million by 1938, and roughly 900,000 in early 1940. Numerous subdivisions were disbanded and reallocated. Lutze fashioned an SS analogous elite formation, the armed Standardfeldherrnhalle, the Standard Field Marshal's Hall, positioned as the SA counterpart to the SS Verfügungstruppe, SS dispositional troops. By the way, I also made a properly broader history of SS warfare if you're interested last year, a couple of videos. And the latter that we just mentioned here, the SS dispositional troops, was the precursor properly of the Waffen-SS as we know them, better known. Excuse me, I drink a lot of. SA re-emerged on a national scale during the November 1938 Reichspogromnacht, the Reich Pogrom Night, targeting the Jewish populace with renewed ferocity, vandalizing approximately 7,500 storefronts, ravaging residences, demolishing nearly all synagogues, comprising the entirety of Germany's stock, by the way, numerous Jewish cemeteries, over 7,000 shops, and 29 department stores. Jews suffered beatings to death, with more than 30,000 males detained and dispatched to concentration camps. Because the thing actually started much earlier, like already from 1933. It was known by the population, like the myth that the Germans didn't know, that they actually knew, like they immediately noticed the Jews started disappearing. It's sort of also very well documented. But aside from this, upon the 1939 war outbreak, the SA assumed training of conscription-deferred individuals in Wehrmannschaften, defense formations, attaining 1.5 million volunteers by April 1940. 60% of rank and file and 4/5 of officers were conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Temporary SA Freikorps materialized in Danzig and the Sudetenland, but were assimilated into the Wehrmacht, and SA affiliation conferred no draft exemption. Throughout the war, non-conscripted SA personnel managed troop entertainment, pre-military indoctrination, so to say, and ancillary duties for the Wehrmacht, police, customs, air raid protection, SS border security, and allied agencies. Roughly 80,000 armed SA operatives organized in Stürme zur besonderen Verwendung, so storms for special use, were subordinated to Gauleiters for quelling potential civilian insurrections. Toward war's end, the SA served as a reservoir for Volkssturm, the People's Storm combatants, whose members frequently perpetrated violence against captives of those favoring surrender, as it's sort of dramatically notorious. Lutze perished in a 1943 vehicular mishap. Wilhelm Schöppmann assumed command until the conclusion. 1945, elevated SA officers, many with prior police tenures, were dispatched as SA Gesandten, so SA envoys, to Southeast European satellite states, functioning less as conventional diplomats than as overseers of compliant regimes, essentially exerting profound influence on host policies in the manner of disguised Reich commissars, thereby implicating the SA in Jewish deportations and the Holocaust to a degree exceeding long-standing scholarly estimates, by the way. this is something you want to, because of course the prestige that the SA had during the Nazi Revolution, as it was called, was too great. It had been, again, too popular, too nationwide to be simply repressed. There was a fabricated and also sort of motivated reason to take out Rome, and the whole SA leadership that, as we've seen, had literally boomed to a degree that the same Rome had not been able to control. It was impossible to do it at that point. Hitler was much more cautious, power concentrating, and sort of he was coming probably from another mentality. It would be interesting to compare the psychologies of both, frankly. We could make a video about this for what we know now. Now, uniformation, just for the sake of, we're talking something military here, so uniformation bestowed the brown shirts moniker from 1924 for the SA. Notoriously, it had started irregularly, as most of these movements at that earlier in time. Participants essentially attended in civilian attire, identifiable solely by red swastika armbands. The November 1922 debut featured gray riding breeches, a wind jacket adorned with the armband, and a ski cap. The brown shirts originated fortuitously when Gerhard Rosbach, fleeing to Austria after 1923, procured a surplus lot of Letov shirts intended for colonial forces in former East Africa, German East Africa, but undelivered due to Allied naval blockades at that point. And upon return, Rosbach introduced these shirts to his Freikorps, and then the Schildjud in Salzburg, standardizing them in the German Schildjud by 1924 via the Schild Sportversand as primary vendor. The earthy brown was proclaimed the right-wing movement's hue in 1925, symbolically linked to native soil and homeland. That was probably the idea of humanity, of the dirt. We often discuss this from a metaphysical point of view, that they didn't, in this sense, mostly know. It was essentially Blut und Boden, because it actually, National Socialism came to acquire that. But at least in the moment, it deliberately contrasted with the communist red, that was considered to universal in at least a sort of internationalistic communist ideology, as well as the Italian fascist black, because they wanted to be German in that sense, not somebody else's sort of fascists. The left arm displayed the Kampfbinde, the combat armband, a red band encircling a black swastika within a white circle. Bans on public brown shirt display in 1930 Bavarian Prussia led to interim adoption of white shirts at a point, paradoxically amplifying public focus because they were just even more evident. And in fact, reversion occurred upon ban expiration at that point. It was easier at that point logistically to keep using the brown shirt. In 1932, the Hugo Boss enterprise received the NSDAP commission to manufacture standardized uniforms for National-Socialist entities in varied brown tones, though designs originated from the organizations themselves. Accompanying the brown shirt were a brown necktie, breeches, and boots. Higher commanders occasionally donned long trousers and military-style jacket in brown for ceremonial occasions. The SA cap was a brown shaft model, initially supple and monochrome with leather visor and chin strap, stiffened from August 1929 with colored upper piping denoting territorial assignment per Gau and regional structure, supplemented by silver braiding of varying widths to signify the rank. Rank badges appeared on the left collar patch, extending to both for Standartenführer, the standard leader, and above with patch ground matching cap piping. A silver twisted cord encircled the collar for these grades. The right patch indicated Storm and Standard numerals. such as 1/5 for Sturm 1 of Standarte 5. Staff elements bore only Standard or Sturmband, the Storm Battalion designations. Shoulder straps employed dual silver-gold cord. NSDAP affiliates initially affixed the party emblem to tie at breast pocket, button, height, or as a pin in party eagle form, later standardizing on the left breast pocket. A brown leather belt supported the SA dagger at the left hip via shoulder strap. Its blade inscribed with the motto Alles für Deutschland, all for Germany. Flag veneration was integral from inception. This was sort of very common, and it was also a military tradition. Alongside storm flags, every Sturmabteilung bore a Hitler-conceived 1922 SA Standarte modeled on ancient Roman and fascist patterns, ensuring full visibility regardless of wind. This is very important because it didn't basically turn, like it remained oriented in the same direction of the unit, quite importantly. And that's also why, in fact, if you look at Roman standards, that's exactly how they had been working. In fact, they were standards proper. And this is interesting as well. The initial 4, crafted by Munich goldsmith were bestowed at excuse me, a January 1923 Nuremberg Party rally. Comprehensive adoption followed the 1926 Weimar Congress with a quasi-religious oath ritual. The 1927 Nuremberg event added 12 more, sanctified by contact with the 1923 Munich Putsch Blutfahne, the blood flag, to imbue the spirit of the movement's martyrs. Where it was being, they started probably taking losses from the police, etc. On October the 10th, 1945, the Allied Control Council's Law Number 2 outlawed and liquidated the SA, mirroring actions against the NSDAP and SS with asset seizure. At the Nuremberg trials, notwithstanding Soviet opposition, the SA was not classified as a criminal entity, interestingly enough, because it had lacked sort of systematic involvement in planning the aggressive war. Think about this as a criterion. Even you may imagine that, I don't know, there was something totalizing about, the same Nuremberg trials were something relatively mild in properly narrowing at the top prosecuted. And of course, Germany sort of took care of other 30,000 criminals of the Nazi regime on its own. But the interesting aspect of the separation of the SA from National Socialism, and considering also the quite brutal and violent properly ethos and identity of the same SA, and contribution especially to the rise of National Socialism, Adolf Hitler to power, is relevant. There was also another point, the fact that documented crimes were attributed to discrete units without proof of pervasive member complicity. So that was actually a way to basically also observe that many violent crimes carried out by the SA had been so generalized to an extent, had been, as we've seen, such almost mob phenomenon, that it's not like there wasn't an actual, let's say, hierarchical responsibility, but it was very difficult to document, also in also Nazi-ized Germany. So it's sort of difficult in a sense, and we understand why these decisions were taken, but how much also what happened during World War II in the previous years, in previous decades, is not really something that we have really addressed, even as Europeans, in general, I would say historically, because you say, it's difficult to talk about these things to an extent, because they are also fairly well documented nowadays, but the way we are completely oblivious of them at large, it's sort of bewildering. For the rest, one could think what was the broader meaning of the SA. Not obviously, in fact, much in the obvious participation to Hitler's rise to power, as we've described. However, mostly as a branch of National Socialism, to say properly what did they actually represent. And in many ways, there was a less compromising, more populistically, in fact, even left-tending direction of this movement that is quite fascinatingly connected with other aspects of European fascism in the origins. For example, think about Mussolini's socialist origin and the fact that at large, in that case, well, we'll talk about the rise of fascism in Italy because it's also very interesting. But in that sense, Mussolini and the fascists were two different things originally, and he was more like the guy who bailed out of the left in that sense, but also had an initial fascist manifesto, like incredibly beyond revolutionary positions for different reasons, were connected with provocation, avant-garde, but also absolute violence. And actually, we will have really properly to start a series about European fascism because it's not really and simply a matter of a univocal origin, and nor one that you can simply and only attribute to something called fascism. All right. Normally, foundationally, we find, of course, like the Italian fascism, that is also where Hitler basically got most of the sort of the insights from, at least in an associationally sort of broader political sense. And so we have this idea also of the two major fascist countries in Europe, with the Axis and so on. But in fascism as a European phenomenon is quite fascinating because you understand how every country had its own way to that, and how there were certain authoritarian governments in Europe, for example, like Pilsudski in Poland, that, however, were anti-fascist, even though they were very much conservative and nationalistic, etc. In every country had its own way to that, right? It's not just like the different national varnish into the same fascist thing, rather sort of different, the other way around, right? Almost, right? So it's incredibly fascinating. And what you see, of course, in Rome's figure that is very sort of tragic and almost theatrical in his demise, you find this sort of crazier, wilder element. I mean, the NSDAP was much more not just loyal to Hitler in that sense, but more hierarchically disciplined. Like properly, the SS will be able to take over the neuralgic centers of the country, even properly at the expense of the German armed forces at large. And so that's something unseen elsewhere, right? In this, the Nazis were very efficient, very effective. In the SI, you find this wilder thugism of incredible sort of cult of the self, but in an individual fashion, in a better and wilder sort of let's spill blood kind of can't wait to take over the power at the expense of all our enemies and destroying. That's the kind of wilder and tamed element that, as we said before, is not even just a fully foretested thing, because largely when we look at that, it's not like they were all communists, of course, but in general, there was a much of great resistance from the other side as well. In fact, we will have to document this. We've seen it a bit with the Freikorps, and in fact, after the first wave of the actual Freikorps period, what you see is mostly, yes, there is continuous political violence in Germany, but at large, they are extremistic forms that at some point get dominated by the National-Socialists. And it's paradoxical, as we've seen, how basically the greatest fight at that point within the system, aside the one with the establishment that tried at least to resist National Socialism, at some point meddling with it or getting involved with it as power was mounting, was between the two groups, like probably the National Socialists now really meant NDSR, right? And so it's an incredible picture. Today we didn't talk about, again, the politological implications of this, but It is powerful, and it's a very interesting sociological phenomenon as well, that also anthropologically speaking, connected with the war and everything, would be very, very interesting to study. And you have to appreciate in that sense also Hitler's success over this, because as we've seen, the proliferation of the SA as a sort of wild and as widespread mob, as opposed to in fact Hitler's much more sort of disciplined and controlled vision, is great part of in fact the same Hitlerian success, and great part of what we also have seen National Socialism becoming, right? And so it was actually a struggle between Germans and views of how that particularly violent phase in German history had basically to lead to, in very different views and sort of very different orientations. Like if you just think how sort of influential Hitler was for Germany in his individual choices during the, for example, in leading the war or actually starting the war, preparing for the war. It's something that if you think of a Rome in charge, like would have been sort of completely different. Okay, this would have, again, I'm not really interested in that stuff, but at large, right, the what this could mean, then what this meant at the time as a struggle was incredibly clear to everybody involved. And Hitler was playing with Rome in quite disturbing and manipulative ways that underscored, however, the threat that Rome represented to him as well. And so it's veritable hell when you talk in archetypal terms of sort of how tyranny has always to watch his own back. Like this is essentially the moral and sort of broader cultural. We can speak of culture here, the dimension of this phenomenon. So again, as I explained at the beginning of the video, I wasn't specifically planning for today's video today. It's possible that I'm going to actually post it another day, which I don't tell you here from it if I post it another day. But in any case, it stemmed from I had prepared this recently. I had another video that I realized was too faulty in the preparation, and again, these things happen. They normally don't, but in a sense, like we are very well disposed at this point for this kind of fallback plans, be alternatives and other stuff. As I said, I'm prefiguring a series about European fascism. I would like to talk about communism as well, because if you don't get what was happening from the other side, you can't properly, just sort of picture the horror of one side doesn't add up, right? Why it happened and how it was intertwined with the broader crisis of Europe at the time, as much as the sort of vicious ideological implications in the struggle from both sides. I don't know how to really create this, because it's sort of difficult to, especially in this time in history, to talk about this stuff, because honestly, compared to when I started Schwerpunkt, it seems like people have completely given up historical interest per se. They just want to be told a fictional story that comforts their own mental issues. Whenever I see also in the comments someone was sort of trying, you immediately understand they don't even listen to what you're saying. They're just trying to pretend that they have some control, and you crush them in me. This is, in the sense, learning from Hitler and Rome can have practically applicable, say notions to be spent. It sounds terrible, but I have in my personal psychological profile, actually, and I remember there are people who have very high conscientiousness and very low in agreeability, which is me, that has tyrannical streaks accompanied with that. So it's something like brutal repression when studying all these movements. And again, the same during the Soviet sort of reminds me of how sort of politically effective at some point such things can be. Not always, obviously. It really depends, right? But how at some point there are some cynically effective moves you have to take, and unfortunately, the history is replete of this. History, politics, war. It's always a bit about this game. We were talking about it yesterday in the video about Ukraine. So here I'm not obliged to follow the sequence because it's more or less I'm probably going to upload it tomorrow. But in general, there is again plenty of examples to draw from. Crazy time. I don't know. This autumn I'm sort of weirdly I don't know, productive and agitated at the same time. There's something about it, not particularly violent, not particularly aggressive, but in a sense there's something strange in this autumn air that I didn't quite feel in the other ones. Maybe my location currently or whatever. It's, I live in in the castle dominating here the darkness as I see kilometers away from the window. But in any case, it's a good scenario. That's also honestly why I make videos about. If I make videos about National Socialism at large, it's going to be either in autumn or spring. For some reason, they inspire me more. Even though I made Hitler's video in September. No, I'm joking, of course, but because the video topic choice is very complicated to explain to anyone, but it's there is something about the brewery did the putsch. There's something like it reminds me of that etheric cavalcade of the sun and in autumn toward the abyss and all this stuff. So we'll have more of that. I honestly, looking at the 20th century videos, we're making too much stuff on the Nazis. Not quite, but here we have made, we have substantial stuff about it. Too much. We have to vary a little bit because, again, it's interesting in school and whatever, but it's not all there is. Unfortunately, in fact, I made a substantially large amount of videos on other topics, and let's hope that in fact videos like this help carrying a little bit sort of more views onto the others, because especially certain topics of 20th century history, I don't know how many views this video will make. I can't think that it's going to be too much necessarily, but I don't know, if I make a video about the Allies, nobody watches, and that's kind of bad, right? It shouldn't happen. It should be something much more seriously approached, because, what do you want to know again? Are you here for the ideological extremism? I don't think that you understand what Schwerpunkt is, if that's the case. At least some things are very extreme, but they're not at that level that you're habituated to think extremism or the extreme better is really about. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.